my negotiation with Orb. In addition to negotiating on the amount of time, I would have negotiated that I got to speak before him because he's a super tough act to follow. And I don't want you to disguise, or I don't want to disguise with the monotone way in which I will deliver my remarks and the complete lack of humor, that there is a lack of passion that I have for the things that I will be talking about. And I'm hoping that my comments might help a little bit to bridge what I perceive to be as a disconnect that we observed both in yesterday's panels and today between the results that are coming out of the academic research and the lived experiences of the community bankers. So with that, I will calmly deliver my comments, and I'll try and keep within my amount of time, probably can. So what I would like to talk about is the 2021 Economics Nobel Prize that was awarded to Angrist and Imbens, and it was awarded for their work on the use of natural experiments in the social sciences to draw causal inferences from policy changes that result in groups of people being treated differently in a way that resembles clinical trials in medicine. In the Nobel lecture, Imbens describes the great importance of knowledge of causal effects for decision makers in government, firms, and individuals in their private lives. And all three of the papers in this session and several of the papers yesterday use natural experiments. Today's panel is based on changes in consumer protection regulations, and they use them to draw causal inferences about the effectiveness of these regulations in changing the behavior of banks and individuals. In his Nobel lecture, Imbens outlines the challenges of inferring the values of these effects from observed data when causal mechanisms are not fully understood. He highlights the 2001 Economics Nobel Prize lecture by Daniel McFadden, who cautions that detection of true causal structures is beyond the reach of statistics, and he recommends, for that reason, it's best to avoid the language of causality. Imbens goes on in his lecture to talk about the critical themes in his prize-winning research, and they are transparency around critical assumptions, understanding the limits of what data can credibly tell us, and making the research accessible to the broader social science community. So I think that these are three important themes for us to keep in mind when considering the implication of the papers from today's panel and the papers from the panels from yesterday. So in a previous Journal of Economics Perspective article, Imbens and his co-author described the gold standard for drawing causal policy inferences as randomized controlled experiments where straightforward causal inferences can be drawn from differences in sample averages between treated and control subjects. Generally, preclinical causal experiments of this type are conducted on animal models, are required for the human clinical trials that were referenced in the 2021 Economics Nobel Committee. So the transparency, credibility, and accessibility are equally important when designing randomized controlled experiments in the natural sciences, but the challenges of doing that are certainly reduced in experiments in controlled environments on genetically engineered animals who are randomly assigned to treatment and control groups and monitored 24/7. The counterfactual assumption that outcomes absent treatment would be the same for the treated and control samples is credible in these experiments in which concurrent treatment and placebo injections are administered. So all three of these papers examine a period, and all of this has been mentioned before, examine a period of evolving technology and economics to study behavioral changes of both individuals who are free to choose where to live, deposit their money, finance their borrowing, and of banks that are free to choose where to do business, what interest rates to pay, what mortgages to originate, and what businesses to finance. So articulating the critical assumptions that underline these choices and how these choices might affect the characteristics of the treatment and control samples is very challenging in comparison to the controlled experiment. So this is me restating what Orv just said, but in a much less passionate way. So taken together, the 3 papers in this session consider important issues related to regulatory actions, consumer complaints, Community Reinvestment Act, and they provide empirical evidence about many outcomes, including mortgage applications, lending rates, deposit balance, deposit rates, and bank branch locations. And I think that these issues are of great interest to regulators, bankers, and individuals, so definitely meet the first criteria. The research design approach taken in these 3 papers rely on a common assumption of parallel trends in the outcomes of the control sample and the counterfactual treatment sample in the absence of treatment. This counterfactual assumption is inherently untestable, and it is especially difficult to satisfy when treatment occurs over the span of decades. And a recent Journal of Econometrics article outlines the difficulties associated with studies with variation in treatment timing. As Inbins describes, transparency around this critical assumption is essential in drawing causal inferences from these studies on natural experiments. So there are several very intuitive articles that have been written about issues associated with natural experiments. One titled Fun with Parallel Trends talks about the effects of transformation of the data. So these papers all use log transformations. And as most of us know, if there's a similar increase in dollars across 2 groups, that increase will not be parallel when you take log of dollars. And most people think the intuition for thinking about dollars is more intuitive than thinking about log of dollars, but it actually causes problems with the parallel trends assumption. There's also a commonality in these papers that they use control variables. In an article entitled Controls and Differences Don't Just Work, there's a discussion of problems associated with putting in controls that can be affected by the treatment. The example that's given again in another Nick Huntington Klein article is that if you control for smoking in a test of whether more expensive cigarettes lower lung cancer rates, it will look like the price does nothing if higher prices decrease smoking. So he notes that any control variables measured post-treatment is potentially itself affected by the treatment. There are also issues associated with the incorporation of fixed effects that differ when we're talking about these parallel trends models. And more generally, these articles talk about the fact that functional form and data transformations are critically important in parallel trends models. So again, I think it has been noted repeatedly that there has been a lot of changes in the data during the period of these studies, and that gets back to the comment that Inbins made about what inferences you can draw from the data that you have, or the generalizability of the results. So in summary, I think these papers all look at really important issues that are of interest to regulators, bankers, individuals. All of these papers, like all papers in the social sciences, suffer from the struggles that we have because we're not allowed to do the sorts of experiments that they're allowed to do in the natural sciences on animals. I am finding it difficult to think that the critical assumptions that are underlying the causal models are being well articulated in these papers in light of the disconnect that we've had over the 3 sessions in terms of the experiences of the community bankers and the results from the papers. And then the final comment that Imbens gave about writing articles targeting non-academics, I think all of these papers could benefit from that. And I think that is a place where banking regulators tend to excel. So it would be nice to see those sorts of offshoots of these articles written. And that's all I have.